Comet is the compact Edsel that rose from the dead to valiantly save a struggling Mercury. The Edsel that wouldn't die is today's topic, here on Hubcap Club. If you're of a certain age, you probably remember the Comet, a compact car based on the Ford Falcon that grew in 1966 to become a mid-size car. What many people don't know is that the Comet was originally an Edsel. When its parent died, it had to fend for itself. Here's its somewhat convoluted story. We begin in April 1958, when the Ford division presented its Ford economy car program to the Ford Motor Company Board of Directors. Approval was granted to launch a Ford-branded compact car for the 1960 model year. Its code name was Ford XK Thunderbird, but we know it as the Falcon. When the newly consolidated Mercury Edsel Lincoln division heard about the new Ford compact, they wanted in on the action. Compact fever was spreading like wildfire in Detroit. So, in September 1958, the request was approved. Maybe a compact would help revive the struggling Edsel brand. The Ford compact would be used as the basis for a smaller Edsel, upgraded to sell at a slightly higher price point. This car was codenamed the Edsel B. I'm not sure when it was officially dubbed Comet. It was the perfect name for the space age. It's graced some beautiful cars, like this 1950 Veritas Comet sports car from Germany, and the 1954 Ford Comet luxury coupe from France. I managed to find some prototype photos, although the quality is poor. Unfortunately, I don't know the chronological order, and I don't have any narrative to explain the process. I do believe this is one of the earliest clays, because it's most different from the final Comet. It retains the more rounded look of the Ford Falcon, with an interesting take on the Edsel split grille. It has thin ribs that divide the grille, then extend up the hood almost to the windshield. Here are two front-end concepts that resemble Pontiac designs. The first one bears some resemblance to the 1961 Pontiac Tempest grille. Notice how small the Edsel lettering is in the center. It's almost like they're trying to hide the name. The second one previews the 1961 full-size Pontiac grille, including a raised rib that extends up the hood. It's not clear to me from this photo, but maybe it was intended to be chromed. Here's a rear three-quarter view. This model has rear fins and canted tail lights like the production Comet, but the execution is unusual, with a shoulder line that kicks up behind the door and extends down the back almost to the rear bumper. The biggest structural change between the Ford and Edsel compacts would involve stretching the wheelbase from 109 inches to 114.5 inches, and the overall length by almost 14 inches. Most of this increased length was in the rear overhang, resulting in a bigger trunk but no increased space in the passenger compartment. This rear view is getting closer to the final version. Notice that the canted taillights are very close in size and shape to the vertical lozenge-shaped taillights on the 1960 Edsel. As you can see in the photo, stylists were thinking of using vertical taillights on the Comet wagon. You'll see in a minute how they handled those lights on the production version. This model is getting pretty close to final, except for the narrow C-pillar and the divided Edsel grille. And it looks like the chrome beltline trim wraps around the front instead of ending at the tip of the front fender. The final prototype photo I have to share is this side view of the wagon. Notice that this is dated July 7, 1959, yet it still displays the Edsel name on the rear fender. Keep that in mind as the story continues. Except for the Edsel name, this wagon looks like the production version. No fins, because it uses the Falcon wagon's rear fenders as a cost-saving move. And just like with the full-size Ford and Edsel, both compact wagons would share the Ford's shorter wheelbase. So, it looks like the Edsel Comet was pretty much ready to go. It was slated for release in March 1960 according to this article in the October 15, 1959 issue of Automotive Industries, titled Ford Comet Due Next Spring. This article states that the Comet was announced to MEL dealers in a national sales meeting that probably took place in September 1959. Careful reading reveals that the new car is only referred to as the Comet, never the Edsel Comet. This paragraph is very interesting, and also a little confusing. Comet was designated as Edsel B throughout its development stage. It is scheduled to replace the full-size Edsel after the 1960 model year. Even before the 1960 Edsel was formally introduced on October 15, 1959, Ford was telling MEL dealers that 1960 would be the final year for the full-size Edsel. This nugget of information, combined with the lack of reference to Edsel Comet, would lead one to believe that Edsel's death warrant was signed somewhere between July and September of 1959. Comet was set to replace Edsel as the third brand sold at Lincoln-Mercury dealers. The Edsel Comet was dead, but the Comet minus Edsel was very much alive. Ford pulled the plug on Edsel production much sooner than anyone thought they would, just weeks after the 1960 models arrived at dealers. The thing is, we don't really know when Ford was planning on announcing Edsel's demise to the press and public. The news only leaked because of a footnote in a stock prospectus, but that's a story for another day. It was not terribly difficult to remove all the Edsel from the Comet. Except for the grille and possibly the hood, everything else was just badging. It was convenient that Edsel and Comet both have 5 letters, so it was an easy switch on the trunk lid. I don't know if these fender ornaments originally featured the Edsel E. This photo is from a production version. Comet was introduced on schedule in March 1960. It was advertised as the only compact car with fine car styling. There were 3 body styles offered: 2-door sedan, 4-door sedan, and 4-door wagon. The sedan roof had a Thunderbird-inspired C-pillar. In my opinion, it looks more like a Ford than a Mercury. The Comet wagon was all Falcon from the cowl rearward. Stylists did a pretty good job coming up with a substitution for the Falcon's round taillights, even if they are a completely different shape than the rear lights on the sedans. The 1960 Edsel Comet was not a Mercury. It was its own market launch, and remained that way through the 1961 model year. You bought one at your Mercury-Comet dealer. For 1961, they were also sold at Meteor Mercury dealers in Canada, replacing the one-year-only Frontenac. Comet was a huge success, selling over 116,000 units during its abbreviated 1960 model year. For 1961, it sold nearly 200,000, outselling the underperforming full-size Mercury by 70%. Finally, for 1962, Comet became an official member of the Mercury family. 2-door hardtop and convertible versions were eventually added to the Comet lineup for 1963. The Comet name had a long tail, and it stuck around for a number of years. In 1966, Comet grew up and became a mid-sized Mercury. In 1971, Comet went back to being a compact, Mercury's version of the Ford Maverick. That lasted until 1977. Ford hasn't used the Comet name since, at least in the US. Interestingly, it is being used today on a tiny MG-branded EV in India. Maybe you have more insider info about the Edsel Comet saga, or know of other cars bearing the Comet name. Let me know in the comments. Until next time, for Hubcap Club, I'm Rob.